My name is Father Bob Barry. I'm the other Dominican here, and tonight I'm here to talk about the second part of the history of the Catholic Church. And before we get started with that, how about if we begin with our prayer, our psalm prayer. So if you'd open up your books, and I think it's on the front page, Psalm 139. Get them seated here. Wow. And how about if we do as we customarily do? The first side will be to my right, from the clock over to the door, and side 2 will be on the left. So let us begin. In the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path, my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame is not hidden from you, when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me. None of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I tried to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. Let us pray. Lord God, we call upon you to send your Spirit upon us. Renew us in heart and open our minds to your wisdom and grace. Be with us now to guide us on your way and bless us with your peace. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Welcome. Housekeeping note, for those of you who haven't had your photos taken during the break, probably about 7:45 or so, if you could stay behind, and we'll take all the pictures over there. Also, we have some drinks and some snacks over here. I encourage you to take as many snacks as possible, because in my theory of education, the brain is stimulated by the lower movement of the jaw, and the more you can stimulate your brain, you're going to need it. Also, what I want to do tonight is try to get from the Protestant Reformation up to the Second Vatican Council. Now that's a lot of stuff, okay? So I'd ask you to please give me indications if your brain is getting full. So if, that's pretty good there, but when it gets up close to the hairline, let me know on that, and we'll trim it down a little bit of that. Okay? We understand each other? Good. The Protestant Reformation. Last week, and please, I think all of my material's in the handouts here. So I'll try not to wander too far from that, so you can take that with you and keep it. When we finished last week, I was talking about the degeneration of theology and really culture in the latter Middle Ages. And the great question that plagued those in the latter decades and really the last century of the Middle Ages was this question of how do I know that I'm saved? There were many different answers proposed for this, but none of them really seemed to satisfy. And this was the question that plagued Martin Luther, the first and the greatest of the reformers. Luther was born in Germany, very strict, very devout family. As a young man, he initially wanted to study law, but then he was moved to turn towards religious life. And a question that remained with him for a good deal of time was this question of how do I know that I'm saved? And to make a very long and involved story short, what happened to Luther was that he proposed through years of study that we know that we are saved if we have faith. And his claim was that faith, first and foremost, above everything else, faith is what brought us the grace of God, and it's faith which guaranteed our salvation. Luther, as were many people at this time in the church, was appalled by the immorality, the corruption, and the degeneracy of the church. And it was not that the church wasn't trying to reform itself. It was, but there were tremendous obstacles to this. Numerous councils between 1350 and 1500 made serious attempts to really bring about reform, but they all seemed to just get bogged down and were never really successful. Luther began his work by challenging a relatively minor issue in the Catholic faith, and that was the issue of indulgences. Catholicism taught that if we do a sinful action and we repent of it and we even confess it and firmly commit ourselves to not committing that sin again, there can be some lingering after effects of that action. And those can draw us back into that sinful action again. And what the church argued was that if you pray, if you do good works, if you're charitable, if you do a number of things, the grace of God will then curb and limit those harmful effects from sins. The church also argued that we can pray for those who have gone to the Lord before us. And we can pray that if they are in purgatory and are suffering because of their minor sins, that our prayers can relieve that burden of punishment and finally bring them to the beatific vision. Well, what happened was that the church, desperate for funding, for money, because it was fighting these terrible wars against the Turks, the church started to take some frankly unethical viewpoints, and there were some unscrupulous preachers who in fact were preaching on some occasions that when you throw your money in the collection basket or in the pot, as soon as that money tinkles to the bottom of the pot, a soul springs from purgatory and goes to heaven. A lot of people were appalled at kind of the crassness of some of the preaching about indulgences. Luther began to protest against this. Initially, he was one of many very assertive, very demanding reformers. And initially he didn't draw much attention. But as time moved on and as Luther became more and more involved in his preaching and in his reforming work, he started to demand more and more changes in Catholic teaching. One of these demands that he made was that the church give greater recognition to the role of faith, the critical role of faith in our Christian lives. And as a result of this, for example, at a certain point in his preaching about this, he began to argue that faith and faith alone brought us the grace of God. The sacraments did not do this. It was our faith in God that brought us grace. And Luther began to attack a number of the institutions in the church which he considered to be human in origin and not really based on the authority of Christ and not really coming through Christ to us. And he began to question the role of bishops. He began to question a lot of the doctrines and practices of the church. So, for example, he called for the abolition of clerical celibacy. He called for the abolition of virtually all of the sacraments except for baptism and the Eucharist. Luther also argued that the church itself was not the great teacher. It was the Holy Spirit who taught us. And when it came to reading and interpreting the Scriptures, it was not the church that told us what they meant and what the doctrines of the Scriptures were. The Spirit would teach us individually, and we were to be the ones who interpreted the Scriptures. His movement caught fire. It was coupled with and united with an emerging German nationalism. And it was not just a religious reformation that he really initiated, it was also a political revolution. And a number of scholars have explained almost everything in the Lutheran Reformation in terms of it being a political revolt against Roman authority. It was Luther's work that gave us the Lutheran churches and the various denominations of Lutheranism. The other great founder of the Protestant Reformation was John Calvin. Calvin was born a Frenchman. His father actually served a bishop in France. And Calvin, as a young man, had a very deep religious conversion and change of mind. Calvin, as many others were, became appalled at kind of the corruption of late Renaissance society. And he demanded moral reform, but he also demanded theological reform. In the Middle Ages, the theologians in the Middle Ages had a very expansive and deep and powerful understanding of the power of human reason. Aquinas and other theologians argued that our minds, our intelligence, our reason, when aided by the revelation of God, we could know, and know with pretty good certainty, what was necessary for salvation. Calvin challenged this. And what Calvin argued was that in the original sin of Adam, the consequences of that sin were absolutely devastating. Our human nature was completely corrupted. We became completely and totally depraved. For Calvin, we were incapable of doing any action that was good in any significant way. Calvin also taught that human reason can really tell us nothing about God. Our human reason is simply, well, as one theologian said, it's like an ant trying to understand the human mind. That's what our human reason is like in trying to understand God. It simply cannot do it. And the things that might appear irrational to us are fully in accord with God's divine will, and we should not challenge God. Now, Calvin argued that individuals are saved. They find their salvation because they are predestined by God. Before they're created, God chooses some to save and redeem them. And God chooses others to damn them and to deny them salvation. We can't challenge God who does this. Our minds cannot fathom God's reasons for this. We simply have to accept that what God does is just and good. And Calvin argued that you may be able to know that you're saved by trying to live a good life, and then a feeling of predestination to salvation will come upon you. But that wasn't certain. Calvin also argued that not only can God, in love for us, predestine us to salvation, and he can do that by a positive act. Calvin also taught that God, by a positive and deliberate act, can punish and damn people for all eternity because of their sins. And there's nothing unjust, there's nothing wrong with this. These two figures were the cornerstones of the Reformation in the European continent. But something else was happening on the British Isles. In the mid-16th century, King Henry VIII found himself in a quandary. The Battle of the Roses had ended just before Henry came to the throne of England. And the War of the Roses was fought over the fact that there was not a male heir to the English throne. A war was fought over this. Henry wanted to make certain that he left a male heir so that this war wouldn't erupt all over again. Now, Henry had married a woman named Catherine of Aragon. She was related to the German royal house and to the Spanish. The problem was that Catherine had also been married to Henry's brother. Now, you can't do that. You just can't do that. Henry appealed to Rome to have the marriage annulled because it was within the prohibited bloodlines. The Pope didn't want to annul it because that would insult the German royal house. And when the Germans got mad at the Pope in the Middle Ages, they just sent their armies south, plundered Rome, and beat up the Pope. The Pope didn't want that. So he refused to annul the marriage. Henry said, I can't tolerate this. He divorced Catherine and married Anne Boleyn. I think it's Anne Boleyn, yeah, she's the second one. It's easy to lose track. Henry then made a much bolder move, and through a lot of political and legal maneuvering, he made himself the head of the earthly church of England. He was the head of the earthly church. The head of the spiritual church was the bishop at Rome, the Pope. But Henry was the head of the earthly and the worldly church. And he, of course, used that to plunder the church, to empty out the monasteries, to steal the gold, and take whatever he wanted. That'll come back later. Now, between 1515 and about 1560, there was just this tremendous flux in Europe over all these new churches and denominations forming. The Catholic Church did not really become involved in this until about 20 years after Luther. And the Catholic Church responded with three measures. First of all, it responded with the Council at Trent. Secondly, it responded with the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and thirdly, with warfare. The Council of Trent started in 1537, and there were 3 sessions to it. And the striking thing about this council is that only about 30 members came to it. It was a very small group. It didn't have thousands of people. And I think in your outline there, I have a list of all the things that the different sessions did. They dealt with celibacy, the Eucharist, clerical discipline, the sacraments, dogma. They dealt with all of the issues that the Protestant reformers brought up. The second thing that the church did was to establish the Society of Jesus. Catholicism in Southern Europe was pretty much protected by the monks and the friars. It was in Northern Europe, Germany, Northern France, the Low Countries, and England, where the Protestants really had their stronghold. The Jesuits were founded as a very highly educated, extremely disciplined, and obedient community. In many respects, they were kind of the fulfillment of medieval monasticism. The Jesuits spread out through Northern Europe, very well educated, very assertive, and they brought back many, many, many people and a couple of nations to Catholicism. They also became deeply hated precisely because they were so good at what they did. The third thing that the church did to deal with the reformers was war. In 1618, there was an incident in Bohemia, and Protestants and Catholics started firing at one another. War broke out between Protestant forces in the north and Catholic forces in the south. And for 30 years, between 1985 and 2015, these armies raged up and down Central Europe. It went on for 30 years. Finally, in 1648, both sides were exhausted, and they drew a boundary line between the Protestant nations in the north, the Catholic nations in the south. And that boundary line was only a few miles from where it was in 1618. It accomplished absolutely nothing. Now, after this, the European world was fed up with religion. The last thing that they wanted to do was to get involved in religious disputes and controversies. The church's primary concern after 1648 was to control movements, intellectual, theological, philosophical movements that might lead to another Reformation. So what the Catholic Church did in the middle of the 16th century was start banning and condemning and prohibiting everything that did not immediately support the Catholic faith. The Catholic Church really built a fortress around itself. And its aim was to shield itself from all of these movements that were now coming up in the modern world. Now, let me go through a couple of these, and I hope I can show you how these were seen as a threat to the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith. The first of these movements that appeared was the philosophical movement of idealism. The traditional founder of philosophical idealism was the French philosopher René Descartes, who was actually taught by the Jesuits. Descartes wanted to provide a new foundation for philosophy. He wanted philosophy to give us certain knowledge. And Descartes argued that if you could find one truth that could not be doubted, that everyone knew was certain and true, you could then deduce from that a whole system of philosophy, which by deduction would be true. That first truth that Descartes discovered was his simple and famous statement, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Descartes argued that the knowledge that we have, that we are thinking, is something we cannot doubt. Now, St. Augustine actually beat him to the punch. About 1,000 years before, Augustine said, I doubt, therefore I am, which I thought was just a little bit more acute to think of it in something like those terms. What Descartes did was to transform philosophy. The traditional medieval philosophy of metaphysics and knowledge of essences, this was all cast aside as being hopelessly obscure and irrelevant and of no value. So European philosophy just parted company after about 1650 from Catholic thought and philosophy. The problem with Descartes' philosophy, though, was this. Descartes argued that the only thing that is certain that I know is an idea. And for Descartes, the only things we really know for certain are the ideas in our mind. And we're not certain that the ideas in our mind correspond to what's going on in reality. For Descartes, we know our ideas, but not necessarily what's out there. The glaze is starting to appear on the eyes here. Yes, I can see it from here. Okay, we'll move on a little bit here. Another movement that had a profound impact on the Catholic Church was what we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment emerged from philosophical and literary circles. And its aim was to bring light and clarity and precision where there was doubt, mystery, uncertainty, confusion, and obscurity. The Enlightenment accomplished this to the extent that it reduced what our minds could know. It imposed extraordinary limits on what we could know. And I think the most common feature of the Enlightenment was its view that we can only know what we can physically and materially determine to be true. You know, I know that this lectern is here because I can feel it and hear it. We're only certain of those things which we can verify through sense perception and that are in the material world. The result of the Enlightenment was that the field of knowledge, of human reason, of human intelligence, became vastly constricted. We couldn't really know anything of the spiritual world. We couldn't know very much at all of things that were non-material. Our minds might speculate about these things, but we have no real knowledge of them. Again, our knowledge was constricted by the Enlightenment. The upshot of all of this for Catholic theology was what we call deism. The deists were a wide-ranging and long-standing group that tried to, in a sense, pacify religion and keep religion from becoming a volatile force. Some of the deists, such as John Toland, argued that the only religious doctrines that we can believe in, the only religious doctrines worthy of belief, are doctrines that can be demonstrated, and demonstrated to reason. Well, if you can demonstrate something to reason, what else can you do but believe it? You know? I mean, to me, it's kind of an oxymoron. But that was very much the whole tenor of deism. The deists, in their most extreme form, held that we only had three obligations. The first of these obligations was to acknowledge the existence of the deity. Yes, there is a deity. We don't know if it's God or many gods. We don't know if it's one God or a triune God. We just have to acknowledge that this deity exists. You don't have to believe it. You just have to acknowledge it. That's how minimalist and reductionist this became. The second obligation that we had as human beings was to abide by the law of nature. And they didn't define what the law of nature was. And if you read the various deist philosophers and theologians, it was a whole range of things. But we had to obey the law of nature. Thirdly, the deists argued God, nature. There was a third one, and I can't remember what it is. Do I have it on my notes here? Maybe I can remind myself of it. Is it on the notes? The three obligations of deism? No, there's a third one. It wasn't very important. Sorry about that. But many of the founding fathers in the American Republic were deists. George Washington, people such as that. They really didn't have much of a religious faith, and it was a pretty minimalist system of belief there. Any thoughts or questions about any of this? We can do some more of that later. Now, the Catholic Church was pretty profoundly affected by the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was, from the Catholic perspective, the biggest catastrophe to strike the church in its history. And it did, its fundamental aim in these years after the Reformation was to make sure that it didn't happen again. Protestantism was so powerful between 1650 and 1800 that it had a significant impact on Catholic thought and Catholic doctrine. And it's my judgment that the Jansenists emerged as something of a Catholic counterpart to some of the radical Protestant theologians and doctrines. Jansenism emerged after the 30 Years' War, and as many were, they were appalled at kind of the corruption of morals, and the Jansenists wanted to reestablish a solid moral base. And Jansenism adopted many of the moral viewpoints of the Calvinists and the radical reformers. The Jansenists argued, for example, that for an action to be good, it had to be good in every single dimension. In every aspect of the action, it had to be morally good. If there was any deficiency, then the act became bad. It wasn't just that it was an imperfect act, it became bad. So, for example, if you saw a tottering old lady struggling to get across the street and you helped her, that was a good action. But if you did it to make yourself feel good, the Jansenists argued that it became an evil action. So they were extreme in this view of morality, and they were pretty unforgiving. They really didn't understand much of divine forgiveness. And the Jansenists became very, very popular. The same trends that wanted to reform the church wanted the Jansenist view of Catholicism to advance and develop. The Jansenists really were strong between about 1670 and the beginning of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, 1789, pretty much eliminated them. Also, after 1648, there was a movement in various churches throughout Europe to lessen the influence and the power of Rome of the Vatican on the individual churches. This was most evident in France. And in France, a movement began which we call Gallicanism, kind of based on the old French name, Gaul, for the name of that area. The Gallicans argued that the power of the Vatican and the Pope should be placed within certain limits and have certain restrictions placed upon it. The Gallicans argued for a democratic election of bishops. They argued that government officials, the state, should have influence, should have some authority in the appointment of bishops. They also argued for the election of clergy. Churches would choose their clergy. And what the Gallican movement did was to weaken the authority of Rome, of the Catholic Church in various countries. Now, beginning around 1700, the monarchies in Europe advanced in their own understanding of their power. This was the era of the absolute monarchs. These kings and rulers felt that everything within their domains should be under their control. And one of the biggest problem groups that they confronted were the Jesuits. And that's because the Jesuits said, well, no, there's this spiritual dimension, and it's the bishop in Rome who has all authority over that. And these absolute rulers began to chafe at the idea of the Vatican and the Catholic Church having so much influence over the minds and hearts of people. And what the absolute rulers did in the 18th century was to begin to follow the pathway cut by Henry VIII. What they started to say to the church and to Rome was, you know, we can suppress you in our nation, just as Henry VIII suppressed you in the 16th century. We can declare ourselves the absolute rulers of these countries, to have full and unfettered authority over the material and the earthly kingdom that we rule. And that can mean that we can take away your churches and your treasures and your schools, and we can control it. And what they did, starting in 1759, is they started to demand the suppression of the Jesuits. It began in Portugal. They were driven out of Portugal. After that, I think it was in 1764, they were driven from France, and then later on from Spain and all of their domains. Now the problem was, the Society of Jesus was the strongest order in the Catholic Church. And just like today, where the Jesuits are strong, the Catholic Church is strong. What these rulers didn't realize, though, was that against the liberals and the radicals, the Jesuits were their best protection. The Jesuits wanted to defend these monarchs from the radicals and the liberals in the 18th century. And when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, they didn't have the Jesuits to protect them, to secure them, and there wasn't much that could be done for them. By 1773, the church had yielded to these kings, and the entire society was suppressed. What most of the Jesuits did was to just move to other countries. Many of them came to the U.S., founded Georgetown University, spread out along the East Coast. Many went to Russia, where Catherine the Great welcomed them. And we'll get to this later. After they were restored again, the Jesuits came back to Europe. The church learned one thing from this. They've never suppressed the Jesuits since then, and they'll never do it again. They will never do it again. They're that important to the society. Hey, aren't I being good standing up here in the Dominican habit saying all these blessed things about them? Okay, let's take a break for a couple minutes. those of you who haven't had your pictures taken, please come on over here. The rest, please go over to the table. Exercise your brain. Thank you. My Lord, how do I get through this? Protestant Reformation. The French Revolution was really kind of the finale and the climax of many movements going on in Europe between 1700 and 1789. There was a very strong secularizing movement. There was a real revolt against medieval theology and philosophy. And there was a growing movement to liberalize and alter the way authority was exercised in Europe. One of the foremost precipitating causes of the French Revolution was the success of the American Revolution in 1776. 3,000 miles away in this yet unknown land, this liberal democratic republic was established, which incarnated many of the ideals and the principles of European liberalism in the 18th century. The American Revolution's success inspired the French liberals. And in 1789, the French Revolution began with the storming of the Bastille. There were calls among the revolutionaries for greater democracy, for lessening the authority of monarchs and rulers, for eliminating a lot of the privileges that the church and the clergy had. And at the beginning, the Catholic Church was in agreement with most of these proposals. And initially, after the revolution began, the church and the reformers, the revolutionaries, got on rather well. But it didn't take long for the revolution to become violent and vindictive. Beginning with the Reign of Terror and Robespierre, the revolutionaries started exterminating those whom they considered to be the aristocrats, the elites, and their supporters. The churches were attacked, and I mean physically attacked. Many of the great monasteries in France were leveled and destroyed. The clergy themselves were attacked and became victims of the guillotine. I've never really seen what I thought was a reliable number of those who were killed during the Reign of Terror and the French Revolution, but it was quite significant. Certainly a lot of aristocrats were killed, and also a lot of Catholics were killed precisely because of that. Following the Revolution, the French Revolution fell under the control of Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte, if he was anything, was a master military strategist. And between 1790 and 1814, it seemed like Napoleon was almost indefatigable. He could not be beaten. He was just a master of strategy and tactics. And time after time after time, European rulers and nations formed alliances to control Napoleon, to defeat him, and ultimately they couldn't. In 1805, Napoleon invaded Italy, and he did something that was actually somewhat common in the Middle Ages. He took the Pope captive, and he brought the Pope as a captive back to Paris. The Pope was cut off from his court, all of his support. He was isolated there. And the Pope, I think it was Clement VII, endured this and opposed Napoleon really through his entire reign. Napoleon, as his army swept through Europe, brought about the destruction of an enormous number of churches and religious communities. Monastic life in Europe, in my opinion, it was destroyed by Napoleon. It barely recovered the destruction that the Napoleonic armies brought on the churches and the monasteries there. So many of the medieval houses of the great orders were taken over by the state and just made into museums. The church was very badly weakened by Napoleon and his armies. His downfall began in 1812 when he invaded Russia. And what the Russians did is what they've done for centuries. They just kept withdrawing and withdrawing and withdrawing into the center of Russia until, as they called it, General Winter destroyed Napoleon. And he got out of Russia with only about half of his army. At that point, the rest of the European nations pounced upon him, and by 1814, he was in Devil's Island. The Pope, the Bishop of Rome, because he endured captivity by Napoleon for almost a decade, was really made the hero of the post-Napoleonic era. He was the symbol of European resistance to Napoleon, and he was brought back to Rome with a festival that I don't think the Italians have ever matched since then. He restored the papal throne, and virtually all of the monarchies of Europe that had been destroyed by Napoleon restored their thrones and their authority. And from 1814 really until 1870, these monarchs ruled with an iron fist over Europe. Anything that smacked of liberalism was just condemned and banished. The only situation I think that's analogous to that would have been Europe and America after the defeat of the Germans in World War II. German National Socialism, anything affiliated, was absolutely banned, prohibited, and condemned. And this is the way the church treated liberalism after Napoleon. This began to fade by the 1840s, and a liberal revolt broke out. The real crisis came, though, in 1870, and that was when the Vatican itself was was overcome by liberal forces. We'll get to that in a second, though. Now, right about the time that the French Revolution was about to break out, the Industrial Revolution began. Beginning in the 1770s, in England and Scotland, the first thing that you had was the invention of the steam engine. And that was the first force or power that humanity had to move things that didn't rely on muscle, human or animal muscle. The second thing that the Industrial Revolution brought about was the railroad. And the railroads of that time were actually able to attain a speed of about 15 to 20 miles an hour, which is about 4 or 5 times faster than a horse could go. And then thirdly, by 1800, you had the invention of the Bessemer process of turning kind of weak and feeble and crude iron into steel, which was much stronger and could be refined much more perfectly. The consequence for the church of the Industrial Revolution is that all of these people who were living as peasants in the countryside, all these people who faced starvation every year, they flocked to these industrial cities because there were jobs in these cities, manufacturing, building, constructing. And at last these people saw some glimmer of hope for financial security and for peace. The problem, though, was that these industrial cities became absolute hellholes. Did any of you read in high school Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, that novel? It was the story of life in these industrial slums in the 19th century. And really, it's worth reading because he wrote it as fiction, but it's not very far from the truth. They were just horrible. These workers were, they were exploited. They faced the very same threat of starvation they faced in the countryside. And these early unfettered capitalists had no scruple whatsoever about doing to them what they did. The problem for the church was that these people who used to live out in these peasant communities that had your local church and the padre, they came to these cities and they were cut off from the church. And they pleaded with the church to do something to help them in their plight, but the church was unable to. So what these people did was to abandon the church and head to the revolutionaries. And it was in the 1840s when really the greatest of all of them, Karl Marx, began his writing. Marx argued for these industrial workers that they should really resort to violence. You know, take your hammer and attack your straw boss with it. The only thing you have to lose is your chains. They aren't giving you any money, any shelter, any food, or any clothing. All they're giving you are chains. And the result was that many of the former Catholics joined in this revolutionary movement. Now that itself wouldn't be bad in and of itself. But the problem was that Marx called for a revolution to overthrow not just this capitalist industrial system, but he called for the destruction of its foundation. And the religious foundation of capitalism was religion. So Marx called for the destruction of religion. What does religion have to do with this? Marx claimed that one of the fundamental tenets of religion is that you should suffer injustice and torment and exploitation and poverty and starvation. Because if you suffer these things meekly, you'll then go to heaven where God will reward you. Dives and Lazarus. Marx argued that any religion that taught this should be abolished. So Marx became an implacable foe of Christianity and particularly of Catholicism. So the Industrial Revolution did not really serve the Catholic Church too well. And it wasn't until the 1870s under Pope Leo the XIII, where the church really responded to the needs of industrial workers. Now, at the end of the 19th century, the church in Europe was struggling with liberalism, with its doctrines, its rejection of religion, and its criticism of the Catholic Church. The First Vatican Council, Vatican I, was called in 1870. And it was called to respond to all of these claims of liberalism, that religion was false, the Catholic Church was evil, none of its doctrines and teachings are true. And this council was partly successful, but it didn't work out too well because in the middle of the council, Rome was invaded once again. And they all had to spread to the hills, and they couldn't complete the work of the council. One of the reasons for calling Vatican II, a minor reason, was to complete the work of Vatican I. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution had advanced quite significantly. And what we saw at the beginning of the 20th century was industrialized, mechanized warfare. It began with the Boer War in 1899, where you had your first rifled weapons, and it only advanced from there. By 1915, we had airplanes, we had machine guns, we had heavy artillery, and later on, tanks. In 1914, the first of two European civil wars broke out. We call them World War I and World War II. But what happened was that at the beginning of the 20th century, Europe fell into a civil war. And all the horrors that this mechanized industrial warfare could bring were visited on Europe. Probably 25 million people were killed in these European civil wars. In both of these wars, the Vatican and the Church's stance was neutral. In neither the First World War nor the Second World War did the Church side with either the Allies or the Axis. And this was a very difficult position for the Church to take. In the Second World War, Hitler was absolutely convinced that Pope Pius XII was working for the Allies. And at one point, he entirely encircled Vatican City with tanks. And if Pius XII said anything that Hitler could interpret as being pro-Allies, he was ready to invade the Vatican and take Pius XII prisoner. But the Church maintained really an artful neutrality. All the while that it was doing this, it was assisting in whatever way it could the refugees and the victims of war. One of the things that's not too terribly well known is how many of the Jews the Vatican actually protected in World War II. A great English Anglican historian, Owen Chadwick, was allowed into the Vatican archives to research all the documents of the Vatican and Hitler in World War II. And the conclusion of his book was that at pretty much every turn that he took, Pius XII tried to protect and hide the Jews in the Vatican. And it protected American airmen who, fled to the Vatican for shelter, but it also cared for, the wounded Germans and Italian troops whenever possible. In spite of what some say, the Pope, Pius XII, did do a great deal to help the Jews. And I think the best testimony to that was that at the end of the Second World War, the chief rabbi of Rome converted and became a Christian. And he said it was because of the witness that Pius XII made. The Church came out of the Second World War in probably the best condition it had been in 1,000 years. Pius XII was seen as one of the great heroes of the Second World War. And the prestige and authority that he had been unmatched for 500 years. He was one of the most popular, he was one of the most authoritative popes in the history of the Church. And I mention that because 16 years after the end of the Second World War, Pope John the 23rd summoned the Second Vatican Council. And one of the things that's unique about the Second Vatican Council is that all of the major councils of the Church before Vatican II had been summoned because the Church was in a grave crisis. In 49 AD, Peter summoned the apostles to Rome to discuss what should be done with the Gentiles. In 320, the Council of Nicaea was summoned to deal with the Arian heresy that was tearing Christendom apart. In 1537, Trent was summoned to deal with the Protestant Reformation. Yet in 1961, the Church is probably as powerful, united, and authoritative as it had been in its history. Why the council then? Pope John the 23rd, as did many others in the Church, believed that the Catholic Church needed to be brought into the modern world. This was his primary purpose in calling the council. He wanted to draw the church out of the Middle Ages, out of its fortress mentality after the Protestant Reformation, and really engage it in the modern world. Another reason that hasn't been mentioned much is this. Nazism and fascism found their happiest homes in the Catholic countries, Spain and Portugal, Italy, Austria. And the anti-fascist forces were strongest in the Protestant countries, Britain, America, the Scandinavian countries. The council wanted to make sure that this welcome that Catholicism maybe seemed to give to fascism and Nazism would never emerge again. And the council wanted to prevent that from happening. Thirdly, the council was called to deal with the disunity among all of the Christian churches and denominations. And the council wanted to review its understanding of the church. Vatican II began as a pastoral council. Its aim was to make the work of the church in the world more effective. It didn't want to deal with the great dogmas and doctrines, Trinity, Jesus Christ, the Eucharist, and sacraments. Its aim was to make the church more effective in the world in which it lived. Now, the four-year council issued a large number of documents, decrees, and constitutions. And I'd just like to briefly go through some of the most important ones. The first one was called the Pastoral Constitution on the Church. And in this document, what the church argued was that collegiality should be the mode in which the church makes decisions and governs itself. The Vatican Council argued that decision-making in the church should be done at the lowest level possible. If there's an issue confronting a parish church, that parish community should make the decision, should be the first to attempt to solve the issue. If that organization cannot do it, the decision should then be raised to a higher level, and up and up and up. And this was a major change in the church, because prior to Vatican Council, authority and decision-making came from the top down, and not from the bottom up, as Vatican II argued. The church was defined less in sacramental terms or dogmatic terms, and more in biblical and pastoral terms. Vatican II defined the church as the people of God. We are the people of God, and our let's lost that thought. We're the people of God, and the images that were used were primarily biblical images. We're the flock that the Lord has gathered together. We are His chosen people. A second document that there was a major change and a major development in the church was the Declaration on Religious Liberty. Prior to Vatican II, much of the talk was about religious freedom. We need religious freedom. The Vatican Council did not affirm religious freedom. It affirmed religious liberty. The church was not saying that we are free to believe anything and everything we want. After the Nazis and the fascists, there's some things you can't believe. There's just some things you just can't believe. What it did say, though, was this. The individual has a right to follow the conscientiously made determinations of the person's reflections and investigations. We are a free people who can determine our religious beliefs. And we're morally required to follow the judgments of a well-formed and a deliberate conscience. Our liberty to do this must be protected. The church wasn't saying we're free to believe anything. It was saying that we have obligations to pursue religious truth. And when our conscience determines that something is to be believed, a well-formed and serious conscience, we have an obligation to follow that judgment. What this teaching was aimed at was governments forcing their authority and power on the religious conscience and the conscientious judgments about religion. What the church was saying here is that you cannot use force to compel people to adopt religious beliefs. A third important document was a document on the renewal of religious life. At the core of this document was a call for religious orders, the Dominicans, Jesuits, Franciscans, Benedictines, to renew themselves and to model themselves more perfectly on the image of their founders. It called for a renewal and an updating of religious life. The document called on religious communities to become more involved in the ministry of the church in the world, with the poor, the hungry, the migrant, the oppressed, the suffering. The decree on priestly training urged that all priests be educated more fully and more completely. It urged priests, for example, to learn the social sciences. It urged priests to, in their studies, be more open to some of the secular fields and to become better educated in these areas. And I think in large part that's been done. I mean, prior to Vatican II, when you went to a seminary, you never studied anything like political science or sociology. Now, you know, those things are common fare for our education. One of the most important documents was the document on ecumenism. Prior to Vatican II, the Church argued that the Catholic Church is the sole means of salvation. Outside the Church, there is no salvation. What the decree on ecumenism said was that the fullness of Christian truth is presented in the Catholic Church. Other churches present Christian truth, but it's not as full and complete as what's found in the Catholic Church. And it argued that people in good conscience can choose a religion other than Catholicism, and they can do so for many good reasons. And the example I like to use is, the case of, say, Serbian Orthodox Christians during World War II. Catholic Croats killed them by the thousands. They just murdered thousands of them. You can't tell these people they have to become Catholics now because it's a sin not to. You can't expect those people to be converted to Catholicism. They follow their own judgments. This document was important because what the church did on account of this document was enter into ecumenical dialogue, discussion, and sharing with the other Christian churches. I mean, before Vatican II, Catholic kids went to the Catholic Youth Center, the CYC, and all the Protestant kids went to the YMCA. Father better not find out that you went swimming over at the YMCA swimming pool. I mean, there was a moat between the various Christian churches. I grew up in this. And now what we have is churches, all the different denominations, sharing in ministry, in prayer, in worship, in dialogue, and it's been just a vastly healthier and more productive structure than what we had 50 to 60 years ago. And I think the Shepherd's Crossing organization in Manhattan is a fantastic example of how ecumenism has really come to shape the churches in recent decades. Also, what Vatican II argued in its decree on the liturgy was that liturgy and worship and prayer should be restructured and renewed so as to meet the spiritual needs of the new modern Catholic community. And what Vatican II did, what the Council did, was to open the doors to some experimentation in the liturgy, but also into bringing back some forms of worship and prayer that had kind of been lost in the history of the church. And what we have now is actually in the Eucharist, a liturgy that's much more coherent and united than it was before. We have a liturgical year and some forms of liturgical worship that are much closer to the ancient practices and the practices of the early church. Many accretions that kind of developed over the centuries were kind of laid aside by the Council, and also it really unified much of the liturgical worship throughout the year, throughout the world. I mean, you go to any country today and go into a Catholic church, and the form and structure of the liturgy is pretty doggone similar, if not identical. Finally, what the Council issued was probably its greatest decree, the Church in the Modern World. In this document, the Church, the Fathers of the Vatican Council, argued that the poor and the needy in our world are to be the focus of our pastoral care and our ministry. The Church was to support the poor and the needy. The rights of them were to be affirmed. Democracy was endorsed in this document, which was something the Church was reluctant to do after, 1550. And the Church really saw itself as being a global community and not simply a European community. I think, in fact, the Second Vatican Council was an enormous success. I mean, the way that the Catholic Church has been integrated into the other Christian communities, the fact that the Catholic Church is probably much stronger outside of the North American and European continents, it's more united elsewhere than it is here. The Church in the past 50 years has reached out to Africa, Asia, and the Americas in a way that was almost inconceivable before Vatican II. And we really have become a global church, and a church that is much more effective in the world. And I think the best sign of how beneficial the Second Vatican Council has become was our visit last week of Pope Francis. I argue that he's probably the most popular individual in the world today. A couple of years ago when he went to the Philippines and said Mass there, 6 million people came to that Mass. It's almost impossible for him to go anywhere in the world and not face literally millions of people. And it's not just that they're excited like they would be, say, at the Super Bowl. There's an exuberance and a jubilation in seeing him. Much of that has to do with the fact that he is simply so humble a man. But also what he represents is kind of the core and the essence of our Catholic faith. And that core and essence is that our faith leads us to something that is true, something that is good, and something that is beautiful. And that's called the grace of God. And I think the Vatican Council has become a great instrument for communicating that. My voice is gone. Let me hear your voices if you have any questions, thoughts, or comments. Clear as can be, and you got every detail of that. I'm talking about turning a fire hose on someone. Nope. Yeah.
You told me something about being in your seminary and the history of the church that you thought was interesting.
About my seminary experience. I actually first went to the Dominicans in 1966, the year after the council. And there was this exuberance and excitement. They couldn't believe the Catholic Church was doing all these things. And whatever happened in the church was all over the headlines. There was a real excitement to it. But in my experience, what happened was that the exuberance of the post-Vatican Church ran into the Vietnam era. And my experience of Vietnam was that it really cast kind of a wet blanket, at least in the American church that I saw, over much of the church. And by 1967, within a year, you started seeing this mass exodus of priests and religious, nuns and brothers, in dissatisfaction and frustration with the church. The problem was that the council did not give us clear and explicit and concrete directions as to how we were to renew and what our aims were to be. The goals and the objectives were frankly rather vague. Renew yourself in the image of your founder. Develop more effective forms of community life. More effective ministries and outreaches. And what started really beautifully in 1966, by 1969 it was kind of being overcome by the anti-war sentiment and the drug culture, and by 1970 the seminaries were cleared out. In the two ordination classes ahead of me, everybody left. And in the two ordination classes behind me, everybody left. And in my class, there's just me and the provincial Jim Marchanda. So there was really kind of this depressing atmosphere of the whole thing is falling apart. And at the time this is going on, we're trying to figure out how to renew ourselves, how to develop a new theological and philosophical curriculum, how to modify our classical ministry in a way that's more appropriate for this time and generation. And it was a very difficult time. There were some brilliant people that I ran into. In that era, our province really had a large number of very extraordinary and gifted people, but also there were some screaming wackos among us also. Oh man, they were entertaining, I think that's kind of common, at the councils. The one thing that struck me about this is, if you look at the great councils of the church, in the aftermath of those councils, there's always something of a backlash against the council. People wanting to go back to the pre-conciliar church and era. I've seen less of that now than I think there was in previous councils. And frankly, all things considered, I think most Catholics are reasonably satisfied with the church now. We're distressed about vocations, but that can be changed. But there isn't a lot of outrage, I think, over, doctrinal issues. I think there's a lot of, I don't want to say happiness or contentment that we really are a global church right now, in the 1950s when I grew up, you never saw a foreign priest, a Catholic from another nation, much less a continent. And now, there's this intermingling of Catholics from all over the world. And you really have a global feeling in the church. I think particularly in university communities, when you have that to begin with. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's actually a semantic study. Obviously, the Vatican II wasn't literally the Second Vatican Council. You have the council on this throughout here. What is different about Vatican I and II than the other two, or like the Council of Nicaea or the Council of Trent, that differentiate them?
Okay, Okay, Vatican I started out as something of a dogmatic council. I mean, it issued the dogma was the Immaculate Conception and Assumption, and it issued the decrees about papal infallibility. Vatican II was different than that because it didn't really want to deal with dogmatic issues like, say, the role of Mary. It didn't define any new dogmas or teachings. The concern of Vatican II was pastoral, but it was also an ecumenical council. In all of these councils, Jerusalem, Nicaea, Trent, and Vatican II, the bishops from the entire world were summoned to the council. And Vatican II really was a global council because they literally came from all the continents of the world. And that certainly wasn't the case with Trent and certainly not Nicaea. So it shared that with Nicaea, Chalcedon, and the other major councils. But I think Vatican II was different from Vatican I because it wasn't aiming at formulating new dogmas. It just wanted to make the church more effective in this new global situation. And it was really kind of a practical council. Now, I think there were dogmatic implications for what was said, but its express and immediate goal was pastoral. Does that answer? Okay. Anyone else? Brother Mike, do you have something to say? Oh, did you have an announcement or anything? No. We can. If you can take your books out and turn to, I believe it's page 39. Church History 101, Part 2. And if you just want to meet with the folks next to you and just discuss any of these questions, you're more than welcome.